Hi everybody, today we're going to be doing a Lulu champion guide from the X rank 1 Lulu in the world. Lulu's a ranged enchanter support who specializes in CC utility and buff for her team. She also provides excellent peel for her hyper carries while also preventing assassins from getting onto the back. Her strengths and weaknesses fall in line more with enchanters, and so she is much more of a scaling champion. Lulu is a very dominant laner. With her Q and the 80% slow that falls with it, she can start fights for her ADC. She's also a very strong peeler with her polymorph and her knockup, who can nullify the entirety of assassins and burst champions. For example, when you're playing versus a Zed or a LeBlanc, the second they try to jump onto your ADC, you knock them up with your R and then you polymorph them, which provides a long-lasting CC to many and most of the burst champions. She's also extremely versatile, both in early game and in late game, with her Q, slowing the enemies by 80%, which provides fight window for you and your AD carry in the early game, but also helps you kite backwards from the early to the late game. She's also extremely good at holding people in place with her W and her R, as we said before, but she's also really good at pushing people forward with her Whimsy, where she can target an ally, increase their movement speed and attack speed. She's also extremely hyperscaly with champions like Kog'Maw, Twitch, Aphelios, Varus, Ashe. Because those champions highly require their auto attacks in fights, she, by adding picks onto them, adds extra on-hit damage, which can increase the amount of damage that they deal. She does have the same cons as enchanters, as previously mentioned. She's extremely squishy, so whether or not she gets hooked or engaged on, she will die extremely fast. In laning phase versus champions like Blitzcrank, it's going to be a little bit difficult to lane unless you play between your minions. She's extremely mana hungry if you are to spam your mana, because even though she's an extremely dominant laner, she still has decent mana costs associated with them. And with a low cooldown on those spells, choosing your abilities on cooldown will run her mana pool dry. So there'll be moments in lane where you are kind of forced to play with your mana flow until it gets fully stacked so that you can get that missing mana regen. She's also extremely dependent on whether or not your ADC can position in fights and in laning. Because remember, as a support, you're not actually the person that's going to be carrying. For the most part, it's going to be your AD carry. In that same vein, when you add on the fact that Lulu kind of works with auto attack carries, she doesn't really work well with champions that require abilities. So champions like Ezreal, mages like Ziggs. Lulu prevents you from drafting in a way that works better with your spells and more with your auto attacks. Lulu's runes usually go primary sorcery, resolve or inspiration secondary. The reason why you want to go sorcery primary is because of Subinary adding poking and shielding to your laning and late game. Mana flow ban increasing your mana sustain so that in lane you don't have that much of an issue using your abilities on cooldown. Transcendence increasing your cooldown reduction. And Scorch for early lane pressure, where you can kind of bully players out of lane and abuse Lulu's early game dominance. I'd like to go Resolve when going bone plating and then Revitalize to survive the laning phase. Remember, because if you can't get past laning phase, there's not much scaling to be done. Now, in the inspiration tree, you usually want to go Cosmic and Biscuits when having a higher HP pool matters a lot more. So versus Soraka, Sona, where you don't necessarily need the resolve tree, you can opt more for the biscuits. Reason to go Cosmic Insight is when you really need to have your flash off of cooldown. These lanes include lanes like Pike Lane, lanes like Blitzcrank, lanes like Leona, where if you don't have your flash for certain timers, you are just gonna die. As always, there's exceptions and runes. So usually versus hard lanes, I like to go Nimbus Cloak because having that extra movement speed once you flash out can mean the difference between life and death. And for the Resolve tree, in lanes where you don't really need to have that much survivability early game, but you need that extra survivability late game, but you're versus a lane where you're not actually in any threat, you can go conditioning and then revitalize, so you have the extra armor and magic resist later on in the game. And finally, if you really want to scale with Lulu, there is no problem with just going absolute focus Gathering Storm, because in the end, Lulu is an enchanter, and enchanters are meant to scale. For matchups, Lulu usually wins versus champions that don't either have long range engage or just tend to be weaker early. So champions like Rakan, Alistar, and Poppy are kind of lower range. Lulu pretty much outranges those champions, so getting auto Q autos is extremely easy. Sona, Yumi, Janna, Renata, Milio, and Nami are champions that lose to Lulu because of her early game fighting power. So just her bread and butter EQ auto in the early game can dish out a solid 200, maybe 220 damage. It's kind of hard for them to fight back. Other than a little bit of healing and shielding, they don't really provide too much. Now I understand that Renata is an exception. She's extremely strong early, but it doesn't change the fact that Lulu outranges her and in short bursts can outdamage her, which is why Lulu wins this matchup. Now for the harder matchup archetypes, Lulu usually loses as an enchanter to most mages. So either champions that can deal higher bursts of damage than her or outrange her by a large amount, she loses extremely hard to. So those champions are Bran, Zyra, Vel'Koz, Xerath, Zillion, and Lux. When Lulu cannot get her autos in, it's extremely hard for her to trade with her picks, which is one of the biggest advantages Lulu has early game. And by nullifying that, these mages can pretty much make Lulu into a shield bot. The engaged champions like Nautilus, Leona, Pyke, and Blitzcrank are super strong versus Lulu because if you can hook her and one-shot her, she is squishy, so she will die, either in 1 or 2 engages, and Lulu doesn't really have anything to stop that from happening, right? And the category for skill difference is a category that I made up because these matchups can be winning, but they also can be losing based off of how experienced you are with the champion. Now, champions like Thresh, Tahm Kench, Bard, Rel, and Morgana, pretty much, if those champions can get an engage off on Lulu and she cannot, trade back or even react to the engage, she will immediately die. But Lulu does have some counterplay, right? And so the biggest counterplay Lulu has is usually her Q. Auto Q auto is like one of the easiest trade patterns to get off on Lulu, and you can start doing that by level 1. And so once you get that rhythm up of auto Q auto, trading them for 100 plus HP, it'll become much easier for you to lane as it goes on. But if you don't get those early trades in, it's much harder for Lulu to win this matchup. Basically, you don't want to get into their range, but you also want to get those short trades off because they don't necessarily outrange you by too much. Thresh is a little bit of a... Thresh and Morgana kind of are an exception to that rule, but the reason why Thresh and Morgana are a skill difference and not in the losing matchups is because their engage is not reliable. Morgana Q and Thresh Q are pretty easy to react to, right? And so versus a Nautilus Flash Auto, it's much more difficult for Lulu to lose in these matchups. That's why being able to outrange them with your Q, it doesn't even matter if you can get an auto in, just being able to get small trades and those small wins in early will just mean that you will keep pressure onto them and be able to win the lane. Now, the other champions that I put down, so Mel, Senna, Soraka, Seraphine, and Karma, they're skill matchups because these are kind of mage/enchanters. But what differentiates them from Janna and the Sona weaker archetypes is that they either can outdamage you, out-heal you, or outrange you. Now, Mel kind of plays a little bit more like a mage, but the reason why she's not in the loses category is because her damage early game is very, very, very small. And so Lulu's shields can mostly mitigate the effect of Mel's poke, whereas as she gets more points into her Q, Lulu also is forced to use some more points into her shield so that it matches. But Mel's damage eventually will outscale Lulu's shields, and that's why Lulu is in a skilled matchup. She has to get something done early, otherwise the lane is going to become harder and harder. Now for Senna Soraka, reason being Senna Q outranges Lulu, Soraka Q also outranges Lulu. But what's different from them and Seraphine, who also outranges, is the fact that they have sustain. Champions that have sustain versus Lulu are harder scaling champions because the same way that shielding provides you temporary HP, healing provides you permanent HP. So it would be only normal for those champions to outscale Lulu. And that's pretty much why a lot of the time you'll see Soraka picked into Lulu, because if the Soraka is really good at landing your Qs, Lulu will slowly get outscaled. And unless you can get a fight started extremely early with an Ignite, Soraka usually can win that matchup. And now Karma, the reason why it's a skill matchup is because Karma's RQW, if done correctly, can stop the Lulu from doing anything in the early game. And the second that Lulu gets snared in this matchup and the AD carry can hit her, it's pretty losing. But Lulu has a little bit of a fix to that, where if she can kite the Karma W, she will be able to live. And that kiting spell is none other than her Q. You also have the option of using your W, but using your W in that fashion sometimes can mean that your ADC will get engaged on by the enemy ADC. Lulu kiting out this matchup until she gets enough points into her E, where she can fully shield Karma's damage and just survive the lane, is extremely important. Whereas Karma's objective is to poke you down, make sure that she can get as many Ws off, get trades in, and she'll slowly kill you. In the early game, Lulu is going to be playing mostly for poke and zone control with Lulu picks Q. She can actually outrange most supports. Lulu does have to be a little bit careful of using her EQ-W combo, as there are abilities that can go off within a matter of seconds, because one rotation of those spells can mean doom for your mana bar. Lulu's most important spell in the early game, I would say, to hold is her W. Reason being, it's an ability that can either save you by providing movement speed to run out of a fight, or by holding it till the enemy ADC kind of engages for a fight is kind of a staple. And if you don't do that, you end up losing more than you gain. In this clip, I'm trying to play behind the minions just to try to make sure that the Ezreal can't get a hit on me. And the second he walks up for the auto, I throw out my Q. And that's kind of how Lulu gets an advantage in these lanes, where she might be losing early, but if you can get these small advantages, you will slowly but surely outscale. In the mid game, Lulu usually wants to play around an AD carry or the jungler that's extremely tanky. If you don't play around your carry, your champion doesn't really fulfill their purpose. The way to get out of lane on supports like enchanters, usually you want to get level 6 because their champions spike extremely hard at level 6, and Lulu is no exception to that rule. Now, there is an added condition where if you can get your support item, you usually want to start your base as fast as possible. And the reason why is because if you can get your base as fast as possible and get 3 wards on the map before the enemy support can get, 1 ward on the map, you will win the vision war. And so keeping that in mind will be your goal. Roaming as Lulu is a little bit scary, as it can lead to you kind of overextending or going for vision that you're not allowed to get. And one way to kind of mitigate that is to put wards over walls. One thing that I learned very early on when I was maining Lulu, and Lulu without a jungler is the equivalent of a 300 gold bag sitting in front of the enemy jungler. So putting wards over walls doesn't really pose that much of a threat because you have that terrain to play around. One thing to keep in mind in these mid-game team fights is that your R should be used as a tool to either knock up or save one person from the fight. And so in this clip, because I end up shielding the Talon after knocking the Yone up, it provides extra survivability to the Talon so that he can end up killing the Yone and the team fight is won. In the later portions of the game, Lulu usually wants to hold her R. Reason being, just because somebody needs to knock up the enemy doesn't mean that you won't be needing your ultimate in the future. Now, there is a trade-off. Usually, you can think, oh, is the fight gonna end up finishing in the next few seconds if I ult? Or is the ult gonna extend for an extra amount of time and I'm gonna need my ult for example, my carry rather than my front line? That's a constant thought that has to go through your mind when you're holding your Lulu R. And if you don't do it correctly, you'll end up with fights where you realize, well, I should have just held my R and learned from your mistakes like I did. That's completely fine. So if my AD carry ends up being, I don't know, like 1 in 9 in a game, I would much rather hold my spells for either polymorphing the enemy or buffing my jungler. On top of that, you always have to be wary of your positioning. In this fight, I'm trying my best to position to the max range possible to my teammates, but also to the max range of the enemy. You'll notice that my teammates are closer to the enemy than I am, but at the same time, I'm in range to use my spells. And so because of that, I'm able to buff my Viego to go in and then use my ulti for extra survivability. Now, I didn't end up getting a knock-up in this fight, but if my Viego was a little bit closer, that fight could have ended up much more differently. And so it's extremely important in this scenario to have held my ult, because if I can get that extra knockup, it might mean doom for the enemy Lilia. One of the tips that I find the most important to experienced or even novice Lulu players is the fact that Lulu's Pic's ability, which is her passive, can actually fire her Q. So by moving forward and then pressing back, you can actually make your Q range extend a little bit longer. By doing that, you can actually extend the range of Lulu Q so that you can get a little bit more range in those matchups that are a little bit difficult because of that lack of range. Now, another really important trick that you can use is the fact that you can also E to a teammate and then use that as an anchor to use your Q and slow the enemy from that range. So Eing on a minion that's closer to the enemy and then throwing your Q can sometimes actually net you a kill when it otherwise wouldn't have been possible. Another really important trick that I like to use in games where some of the models of the characters are actually bigger than you would think. So champions like Gragas, Galio, and they can stack on top of each other to the point where you won't be able to actually shield the person you want. And one thing I love to do in those scenarios is I love to click my shields and my W and all of my buffs pretty much on portraits. Reason being, you can't miss on those portraits. But if you end up shielding, let's say, your top laner rather than your tank that's taking all the damage, it can actually be a huge difference in a fight. Now, that's not something that you can use on the enemy, so polymorphing the enemy is a little bit more difficult, but it's still better to keep in mind that using portraits in teamfights is pretty important, especially for those bigger models. Another thing to really keep in mind is that a lot of the time when divers have to get on your backline, usually they'll use a dash or a teleport or a blink to get there. So whether it's a TP, a flash, or a Zed ult, you usually want to hold your Lulu R for that knockup to especially hit them when they're doing that engage. So usually, versus a Zed, R'ing after he lands from his R will just mean that you'll be able to R and then follow it up with a W. And guess what? The Zed won't be able to play for the next 3 seconds. All in all, Lulu is pretty much the pinnacle of Enchanter gameplay, especially for the early game dominant players. She's kind of a top tier choice when she's meta, which she is right now. She was rank 1 literally a few days ago. Reason being, she's extremely strong with hyper carries. Now, she might lack hard engage, but remember, her 80% slow on her Q is utility and defense that other supports usually don't have. That's why she's probably one of the best and most viable enchanters. If you enjoy playing scaling champions, but also want to get in that early game dominance, Lulu will be the champion for you.